The following is an extended sample of Book 3 of the Tugurlan Chronicles, titled Vampires and Werewolves. It is provided, courtesy of the author, to help you have a better idea of whether or not you will enjoy the story. It exceeds what is provided by booksellers, but was created with an AI voice. If you do not enjoy an AI voice, this video is not for you.
The Tugurlan Chronicles. Vampires and Werewolves. Book 3. By Eileen Sheehan. Prologue. Just when we thought we could take some time to unwind and recover from our horrific ordeal with the mutant vampires in the Las Vegas den we destroyed, Bruce had an unexpected run-in with werewolves outside his cabin in the hills of Owego, New York, and was wounded. Now, instead of searching for vampires, we searched for a cure for Bruce before the werewolf affliction took hold of his body permanently. Hearing about a paranormal group in Phoenix that could possibly help us, we wasted no time boarding a plane. The mutant vampire den may have been destroyed, but Dracula's vampires are still out in full force, and they're looking for us by orders of Dracula. To add to the peril, we were forced to partner up with Nandrew, the local vampire leader, to help us hunt for Bruce after he morphed into a werewolf and ran off into the desert mountains before a mystical high priestess was able to administer the cure. While roaming the caverns of the Arizona mountains, Bruce met and fell in love with Tatiana, a young Russian woman who was running from the vampires. Fortunately for him, she was no stranger to the occult and accepted him in both human and werewolf form. It's a bonus that she was able to communicate telepathically. Even though she vowed to stay with him no matter what form he was in, she was in agreement with everyone that a cure would be the best for all. We finally got the cure in him. Unfortunately, we didn't get it into him in time to totally release him from the werewolf affliction. The leader of the paranormal group in Phoenix had mentioned someone in Middletown, New York, who had extensive knowledge on werewolves, so we headed back east in hopes he could help us. Vampires and Werewolves picks up my story at this point. Much of this part of my story happened to those around me. As I did with Vampire Iniquity in The Cure, I will continue to do my best to keep my narrative informative, factual, and flowing, while telling the parts that occurred in my absence. Chapter 1. What did I look like when I turned? Bruce asked. Pardon? Tatiana said. What did I look like when I turned? Did I frighten you? Bruce continued. Not so much, but you changed, she replied. How? Bruce asked. More like a wolf, less like a man, she said matter-of-factly. Oh, he mused, would you say that's good or bad? It depends, she said. On what? He asked. On how you look at it, she replied as she lightly kissed the tip of his nose. I take you as you come, my love. For Bruce there was only one way to look at it. It was bad, very bad. He was moving more and more away from his human self. Soon the curse of the werewolf would be impossible to remove, if it wasn't the case already. He didn't know why, but he thought he still had time. Tatiana thought so too, as did Shen and me, but none of us were certain. None of us really knew much about the werewolf, or as our research labeled it, the lycanthrope. Now, our hunt to destroy the rogue mutant vampires that managed to escape the massacre in Las Vegas was halted in order to focus all of our attention on finding out if we were right. Was there a cure for the lycanthrope affliction? If there was, would we find it in time? He heaved a troubled sigh, while forcing a smile for Tatiana as she moved to stand behind the chair he'd only just unceremoniously dropped his solid, muscular bulk into. Placing her smooth, slender hands gently on his broad shoulders, she kneaded the tenseness out of his muscular, rock-hard torso. After a few moments of her tender and skilled ministrations, his forced smile grew genuine and his body visibly relaxed. I wonder if Dan and Shen had any luck, he mumbled, more to himself than to her, as he stretched his neck from left to right, enhancing the effects of her massage. I'm tired of waiting around. There's got to be something we can do. Tatiana's soft, plump lips caressed his lean muscular neck as she wrapped her long, slender arms around the width of his shoulders, crossing and resting them over his broad chest. Dan said they are meeting with the professor today. I do not know of anyone else to turn to. If you do, then I will support you. We can go, she murmured in a way that accentuated her Russian accent. He shook his head slowly. I've never even thought werewolves were real, or vampires, or anything else that goes bump in the night, for that matter, he said as he emitted a sarcastic chuckle. I definitely didn't associate with any nut that did. He placed his elbows on his knees and slowly rubbed the tension in his face in his powerful hands. So, we wait, she said. Her words floated softly to his ears. Having spent such a great deal of her lifetime as a captive of the mutant vampire leader, Wadham, Tatiana learned a great many tricks for survival. The one that always served her most was her ability to speak in a tone that was so soft and gentle, the average ear could barely pick it up. Since Wadham's vampires were filling themselves with human DNA daily by way of cannibalism, their senses were dulled and their hearing wasn't as acute as that of the original, pure, vampire who feasted only on clean, fresh-flowing blood. Their hearing was still better than that of an average human, but definitely dulled in comparison to what a vampire's should be. Her discovery of just the right voice volume and pitch made it easier for her to speak to other captives without being detected. Since Bruce's affliction had begun to take hold, his senses were heightened, while in human form, when he was agitated almost to the degree of what they were like when he actually transformed into a werewolf. Because of this, she often spoke in soft tones, knowing that a normal volume of speaking would grate on her lover's already frazzled nerves. It is unfortunate that the professor was traveling when we arrived from Phoenix. I am not very familiar with the ways of a werewolf, but I believe that the more times you change, the less your chance is of reversing the affliction, she said with concern. After a long silence she added, there is a full moon in a few days. Although Bruce turned several times without the moon being full, he'd still maintained his human thoughts. We all wondered what would happen once the full moon came around. Would that be the thing that strips the remains of his human self from him while turned? I know, he said with a sigh. We'll have to do something. It's a few hours' drive from here to my cabin outside of Owego. I'm thinking we should head up there. I don't want to be in a motel in the heart of Middletown when I turn, and I don't trust going into these mountains. The Catskills are far more populated than the mountains around Phoenix. Do you want to wait to hear from your cousin and his friend before we go? She asked. We're cutting it close as it is, he said. If they're successful, then we can just enjoy my retreat in the hills. If not, then we need time to make preparations for containing me when I turn. I can't be wandering around the hills of New York. I'm bound to get shot, especially since it's hunting season. As long as they don't cut off your head or take out your heart you will survive, she teased. Are you sure about that? He asked with sincerity. Is that true when you're still turning, or do you have complete the process first? She looked at him with sadness as she shrugged her shoulders and slowly shook her head. She simply had no answer to that. Neither of them spoke of what might happen should he encounter an unsuspecting human in the mountains while in his animal state. They didn't want to think of the possibility of Bruce losing his ability to reason like a human and contaminate or, even worse, kill some innocent person who had the misfortune of crossing his path. Bruce had spent a considerable amount of time planning what to do when the full moon came around. He'd been able to disappear into the deserted Arizona landscape when he made his first transformations, but the East Coast wasn't as generous with unpopulated areas in which he could seek refuge. Even at his mountaintop retreat, he had only to go a mile or two to reach a neighboring cabin, trailer, or other type of dwelling. Things were different on the East Coast. He needed to take that into consideration while he waited for Shen and me to return with the much-needed cure that he so fervently hoped existed. He'd created a small root cellar beneath his cabin, but hadn't done much with it other than stock it with a few of the barest emergency supplies. There might be enough room in it for him to hold up during the full moon. Of course, if Tatiana insisted upon joining him, there'd be a problem. He wrestled with the idea of suggesting she go back to San Diego to be with her half-vampire, half-human, infant brother Charles. He could only imagine the internal struggle that must be going on inside her right now. She had to be torn over where she should be, in New York by his side during his time of turmoil and need, or in San Diego protecting Charles from the vampires that vied for the privilege of presenting him to Count Dracula. It was most unfortunate that Dracula's son, Dragomir, and his protégé, Ossip, who was also Tatiana's brother turned vampire, were in attendance at Charles's birth during the Las Vegas den's demise. Had they not been, perhaps Charles would have remained sheltered from Dracula and grown up as a normal human child, never knowing about the dark side that resided in him. As it was, the word reached Dracula of his son's demise and his grandson's birth. Now, the entire vampire kingdom sought the baby's whereabouts in hopes of being the one to earn the praise he'd receive upon delivering the boy to the vampire king. Having lived within the confines of the Las Vegas den for the majority of her life, Tatiana knew fully well that a vampire child who was born of a human could live a life of a human without ever knowing of his vampire blood as long as he never tasted another human's blood. She also knew the den better than any survivor of the massacre. It was easy for her to snatch her newborn half-brother from her dying mother's arms and disappear before Ossip could react. What wasn't as easy was finding places to hide both herself and Charles in a strange world she knew very little about. Their one saving grace had been Elsa, a voodoo high priestess who'd taken Tatiana under her protection and made it her mission to keep Charles safe. Elsa was by far the best person to be protecting her baby brother from the vampires that were fervently searching for him. Even though the child was of Dracula's lineage, he was of hers as well. If left alone, his human blood had the power to prevent him from turning. It was up to Dracula to make certain the change took place. Otherwise, Charles could lead the life of a human without ever knowing his other half. Dracula had lost 2 sons, one in the massacre of the Las Vegas den and one in the mountains of the Arizona desert. He was frantic to keep his bloodline going. Therefore, it was imperative that Charles be brought to him and made to turn. The pressure to keep him safe was intense. Elsa had a huge responsibility on her hands. She also had magic and spirit help to disguise and hide the child from the vampires. Shielding him from discovery was something Tatiana, Bruce, Shen, and I couldn't do nearly as well, if at all. All we could do would be to fight them off once he was found. Right now, we needed to put all of our attention on Bruce's affliction. If we weren't able to turn things around, we'd be less one vampire slayer. Of course, lycanthropes were notorious vampire slayers in their own right, but could we count on Bruce being able to stave off the animal in him and work in cooperation with us when the time came? The closer he came to losing his humanity when he turned into a werewolf, the riskier it became. There was also the question of whether he'd still have our Tugurlan Slayer capabilities when he wasn't in wolf form, or would they be lost to him. Bruce looked lovingly at the young woman next to him and his heart swelled with pride. How strong she was to have endured so many years as a captive in that monster, Wadham's den. How horrid to have to live amongst cannibalistic vampires while she watched the human trafficking and slaughter that went on daily. How had she managed to escape being sold, or turned, or worse, eaten? He knew the answer, of course. She'd been captured at an early age and immediately caught the eye of Dumitru, Wadham's favorite son. The den was given orders not to touch Tatiana while she grew and developed in the beauty she now was. She'd been saved to become one of Dumitru's queens when he was crowned lord of his own den. This was considered an honor that Tatiana was expected to be grateful for. Her other option was to become one of the many sex slaves and breeders that were used and abused by the male vampires of the den. Since she'd been captured at such an early age, they were simply waiting for her tender flesh to mature to a point where it would give the most pleasure to Damitru in his bed, as well as birth healthy, strong babies from his seed. The lust of a vampire far exceeded that of a human, and it took a strong, well-developed human to be able to withstand the abuse a vampire put her through. Although she'd be turned into a vampire upon becoming a queen, that was off in the distance, and she'd have to withstand his attentions in the meantime. Because of this, she was nurtured and cared for like prize stock getting ready for the county fair. Tatiana's mother, on the other hand, had been bedded by Wadham and various other males in his attendance and was used in the breeding stables until her body could withstand no more. Charles was her final birth. He arrived just before her life force collapsed. I mercifully killed her before Dragomir could honor his promise to Ossip and turn her vampire. Unfortunately, this act of kindness was something that took seemingly forever for Tatiana to come to terms with and forgive, even though she understood. If Tatiana hadn't been there to snatch Charles from her mother's dying arms and escape the den, Charles would surely have been presented to Dracula by Ossip. Poor Ossip was turned by Wadham in the cruelest of manner and then cast out of the den to fend for himself. To his credit, Ossip managed to make his way to Dracula's castle, where the king of all vampires took pity on him and purified his body. He was changed from a mutated, flesh-eating vampire, to the original state a vampire should be in, a creature of the night that thrives on the fresh blood that pulses through the veins of living creatures. Of course humans were their prey of choice. Ossip's gratitude and desire for favor in Dracula's eyes were a driving force that superseded any family ties and loyalty he may still have buried deep within him where Tatiana or Charles were concerned. Had he been successful, he not only would have taken Dracula's newborn grandson back to him, but he'd have turned Tatiana into a vampire as well. Tatiana's telepathic abilities were a terrific help to her while she struggled to survive in the shadows of Wadham's den. She did her best to keep a low profile while she wandered amongst the occupants of the den as captive. It continued to be of great value for her now that she was on the run and partnered with us as we searched for a cure for Bruce's werewolf affliction, as well as a way to protect Charles from being swept off to Dracula's castle to have his vampire side activated. Either task on its own was daunting, but the two together were incredibly overwhelming. "You should think about going to Charles," Bruce said in a raspy voice. He knew the words needed to be said, but he dreaded how she might respond. "I will stay," she said softly. "I have given this much thought. He is safe with Elsa. I should stay here with you. You are still too new with the affliction. You need me. I should stay, at least until after the full moon. Then, perhaps I will go to check on Charles." He studied the auburn-haired beauty carefully. In years and appearance, she was still young, 18 to be exact. The nightmare she'd endured for so long, beginning with her father's death and continuing with her mother's folly in trusting the wrong man to see to their passage to the United States, had aged her mind beyond her years. They'd been out to sea only a short time before their ship was captured and they found themselves victims of a vampire house of horrors. He was grateful it only aged her and hadn't driving her mad. The maturity of her mind was the reason she'd bonded with him so completely. He couldn't help wondering if they'd have been as compatible had she come to his country and led the normal life her mother had intended for them. Probably not. There was, after all, a distinct chronological age difference between them. He'd heard himself described by one of his great aunts as handsomely plain. Surprisingly, this paradox of descriptive truly did suit him. There was nothing really striking about his brown, deep-set eyes that were placed just the right distance from his narrow and straight nose, or his perfectly shaped mouth that stood firm on a face that accentuated it with solid cheekbones and a squared jaw. They blended together to create a pleasing sight, but not a striking sight. No, stating that he was handsomely plain was perfect. Tatiana, on the other hand, was strikingly exotic. Her rich auburn hair tumbled down her back and accentuated her perpetually ruddy cheeks, plump rosy lips and crystal blue eyes. Her thick brows were perfectly formed and required not one bit of touch-up to maintain their shape. Hers was a beauty that defied the assistance of makeup. On the few occasions when she did apply it, he felt it took away from, rather than enhanced her natural loveliness. Not a day went by where Bruce didn't give thanks for the good fortune of being in a relationship with such a loving and lovely woman, even if she was only half his age. The ringing of the telephone brought him out of his thoughts and back to reality. "We should start packing," he grunted, as he stretched for the receiver. "Yeah," he grumbled into the mouthpiece a little more harshly than intended. Tatiana watched his facial expressions while she listened intently to his end of the conversation. She surmised that he was talking to me, not only because he was freely discussing his need to be at his cabin before the full moon, but because he was also discussing my rocky relationship with Jessica. Jessica had once again placed demands on me that I was hard-pressed to fulfill while I was kept so deep in the intense search for the solution to Bruce's dilemma. Tatiana shook her head. She didn't know me well, but after she forgave me for putting her mother out of her misery, she didn't have to know me well in order to recognize that I was a good man with a big heart. She felt I deserved a woman who'd be kind and supportive of me. This Jessica woman sounded like a shrew. If anyone wanted her opinion, she was certain that I deserved better. Bruce had mentioned that I was considering marrying her. This was something she truly didn't understand, since it was clear that I didn't love her. I may care for her, but the few times she'd seen us together it was clear to her that I didn't love her. Bruce hung up the phone and heaved a long, heavy sigh. His rich brown eyes locked with her expectant blue ones as he choked out the words, "No luck." She straightened her back while she lifted her chin and rotated her shoulders. She reminded him of a fighter getting loosened to go into the ring. Her sad eyes followed the lines of his square jaw. It was tight, very tight. Is he fighting the urge already, she thought. It cannot be. It is too soon. Admittedly, Tatiana was far more familiar with the ways of a vampire, even if the ones she'd lived amongst were mutants. She'd listened to enough conversations and snuck enough books out of Wadham's library to read in the recesses of the den when no one was around to make her a fairly proficient resource where vampires were concerned. The werewolf, which was also known as the lycanthrope, or lichen for short, was something she knew very little about. Now, she was locked in a motel room on the outskirts of Middletown, New York with a man whose human side hadn't yet allowed the lichen side to take complete control, but it was a daily battle with him as the cycle of the moon progressed. If the stories were true, he should only be concerned when the moon grew full. If the stories were true. She filled her lungs with as much air as they'd hold and then expelled it all completely several times. The heavy tenseness left her head and peace slowly consumed her. She'd been held captive by slave trading, cannibalistic vampires for so many years that she could hardly count them and had escaped it alive and well. If she could do that, then she could deal with one lone lycanthrope, especially when he loved her like he did. She stroked his thick waves of light brown hair and locked her fingers in the heavy mass while she used her other hand to pull his face toward her. "Then, we go to the cabin," she said firmly. Chapter 2. I put the telephone receiver back into its cradle. I'd used a public telephone to call Bruce because we weren't sure if our own phones were secure. At first, I thought this was a bit paranoid, but after conversing with Shen about the ways of the vampire, we decided there was no such thing as being too careful. We needed time away from the fight so that we could focus on finding a cure for Bruce. The least little thing like a phone call could expose our whereabouts to Dracula's hunters who were certain to be on the lookout for us in hopes of being led to Charles. There was also the matter of Dracula's orders to bring the slayers back to him. We weren't sure, but we assumed it still stood. Surveying the dining room of the neighborhood's most popular diner, I scowled. Shen should have joined me by now. What could be keeping him? I smiled flirtatiously at the beautiful 5'5" sinuous hostess as she guided me to a booth. My eyes focused on the richness of her waist length, jet black hair as it reflected the artificial lighting that permeated from the myriad of chandeliers that Greek diners seemed so partial to. The cut of her Dolce & Gabbana pantsuit accentuated her slender waist as it hugged her body while giving way to the gentle sway of her curvy hips. Her hair cascaded down the middle of her back in layers of loose, lustrous locks that practically begged to be fondled. I fought the urge to do just that as I moved past her and slid into the deep-seated booth that she directed me to. I felt a little heady as I inhaled the exotic scent of her perfume. As she placed my menu on the table before me, her delicate, long-fingered hand grazed mine. It felt cool and firm against my seemingly burning flesh. I looked deep into her large, dark brown eyes and was almost lost in the deep pools that looked to belong to a world so different from the one we occupied. It was a strange sensation and I quickly pulled myself back to reality. The hostess appeared equally affected as she nervously stepped back from the booth, while briskly informing me that my server would be attending me shortly. As she started to move away, I reached out and grabbed her wrist and once again noted the coolness of her flesh beneath my touch. I stared at her flawless porcelain skin while she watched me warily. Once again I felt as if I was being pulled, as if lost in something, somewhere. I couldn't explain. It took great effort for me to regain control and not be swallowed up by the sensation. I cleared my throat. "You seem familiar in some way," I said. My voice was raspy. "But, I'm certain we've never met." "Have we?" "We've never met," she responded, guardedly. "I'm Dan," I said. After a few moments of silence while I waited for a response that never came, I added, "And you are?" "Magdalena," she uttered in a guttural tone. "I am Magdalena. Now, please excuse me. I must get back to work." "Do people call you Magdalena or Maggie?" I asked. I was uncertain why I was refusing to relinquish her wrist. Feeling her tremble beneath my grip, I reluctantly loosened my hold. Why had I even grabbed her like that? I'd seen many beautiful women in my travels and certainly many that equaled the exotic loveliness of the beauty I held captive. There was some unseen thing driving me to pursue this lovely creature with the porcelain skin. Something I couldn't explain, not even to myself. "Maggie," actually, she managed as she reclaimed her wrist from my grip and rubbed it absent-mindedly, "but I prefer Magdalena." I flashed her one of my famous lady killer smiles and nodded as I said, "Then, Magdalena it is." The corners of her sensuous lips hinted of amusement as she turned and walked away. My head cocked to the side while I focused once again on the rhythmic swaying of her curvaceous body. I was so intent on watching her as she moved about the room that I failed to acknowledge Shun when he seated himself in the opposite side of my booth. He picked up the oversized menu and lightly tapped it on the back of my hand. "Hey, sorry I am late," he said. "Which do you prefer, Maggie or Magdalena?" I asked. I shifted my body to face my newly arrived companion, but my eyes never relinquished the newfound vision of beauty. "What?" he asked as he turned the pages of the menu and searched through the daily specials. "I don't see them here." "What are they?" "They're names, not food," I replied with amusement. He followed my stare until his own eyes locked with the dark, mesmerizing ones belonging to the hostess across the room. "I should have known," he chuckled. "Is that the woman?" I nodded my head. "And she is in need of a name," he continued. I grudgingly turned my attention to him and gave an exasperated grunt. "She has a name," I said. "It's Magdalena, but people call her Maggie." "I do not see the problem here," he mused. He was already bored with the topic. "She prefers Magdalena," I explained, ignoring his obvious lack of interest. "Then call her Magdalena," he scowled. I prefer Maggie, I mumbled. I am surprised that you are obsessing over the name of our hostess when we have a much bigger problem to work out, he grumbled as he scanned the menu. Sorry, I said. It's the strangest thing. She showed me to the booth and it was like I leaned into the table and brought face closer to his while lowering my voice to just above a whisper, I just don't know. I became, as you say, obsessed with her. I leaned back into the booth and muttered, you'd think I'd never seen a beautiful woman before. Shen took a moment to look more carefully in Magdalena's direction. She was speaking intently to a tall, slender male server. She must have been reprimanding him because neither looked happy. She certainly is striking, he muttered as he turned his attention once again to the menu. Has the server been here yet? I am starving. I'm right here, sir. I apologize for the delay. The hostess required my attention for a moment. My name is Garth and I'll be your server today, said our server, who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. We looked up at the tall server as he stood stoically with pen and order pad in hand. He was the same one who, just seconds ago, was engaged in serious conversation with our hostess. How did I get across the room so fast? Shen mused. He considered broaching the topic, but after looking into a pair of flickering amber eyes that hinted of flecks of gold he thought better of it. It was quite possible that we were being served by a super being of some sort, even if there'd been no indication of it so far. These days, we needed to suspect everyone and exercise caution always. Shen scoped the room for signs of more creatures such as our server, but saw no one. He hurried through his order and urged me to give mine quickly under the guise of his hunger. The truth was that he was anxious to have Garth leave so that he could find out if my impression was the same as his. The expression on Garth's face gave Shen reason to believe that he was enjoying the tortuous speed, or lack of it, in which he took our order. When he finally sauntered away toward the kitchen, Shen emptied his lungs of the air he'd been holding. What was that? He blurted. You noticed too. I said. I did, and I do not like it, he said. Maybe we should leave. We just ordered, I replied as I stretched my body languidly. I was still coming down from the high I experienced after my encounter with Magdalena and I had no desire to rush it. It had been a long day, or should I say month, and I was tired and hungry. I looked around the ornate and obviously well-used dining room. It seems harmless enough for now, I said. Besides, we can't live on air. I don't know when you last ate, but it's been hours for me. Me as well, he said in a hushed tone as Garth moved toward us with our drinks. I suppose you are right. We will eat first and then get out of here. Sounds like a plan, I mused as I locked eyes with our mysterious server from across the room. Chapter 3. Magdalena watched the young couple walking in front of her with minimal interest as she followed them down the lazy darkened street. It would be so easy to catch up with them and go unnoticed. She hadn't seen a car or another person for the last 10 minutes. All was quiet. Even if she did succumb to temptation and partake in human blood, it wouldn't change the fact that she couldn't get her mind off Shen and me. She was especially taken by me. She found my sandy hair and facial structure strikingly handsome. Although both of us made every sense she possessed alive and alert, it was me who struck her the most. Perhaps it was because of our touch. She rarely touched humans, and for good reason. It brought forth a part of her that she worked hard to suppress. She was born a vampire in the Earth year 1010 BC and saw quite a few changes in the vampire kingdom since then. Many of the changes were those of which she didn't approve, but some were welcome changes that she was grateful for, like the fact that she could exist alongside humans with minimal difference. She still needed blood for the mainstay of her survival, but she'd ceased drinking human blood centuries ago when the committee offered her the choice to remain on a human blood diet or learn to suppress the urge and return to life of existing on the blood of nature's creatures. Knowing the repercussions of a human blood diet, she went into a rehabilitation program to cleanse and realign her body. She now lived off the nectar of animals and fowl, along with grains and plants. Like a human who was a reformed drinker or smoker, the memories of the addiction stayed buried. The only time they surfaced and she found herself drawn to hunting a human was when she happened to accidentally touch our warm flesh, like she'd done that evening with me. The touch was electrifying and far more intense than she'd experienced, ever. What could it mean? It made her wonder who or what I was. She'd heard rumors that a few mutant vampires had escaped the massacre in Las Vegas and were setting up once again. Could we be of them? No, she thought not. Although she'd never come in contact with a mutant vampire, my touch was far warmer than a mutant's would be. She was certain of that. There was also the rich smell of delectable blood that permeated the pores of my skin. Surely, a mutant didn't smell so scrumptious, even if they did consume human blood as well as their flesh on a regular basis. She decided that we were humans, but not normal humans. Garth had sensed that something was amiss almost as soon as she walked away from my booth. He'd even brought attention to himself by delaying his trip to take our order so he could sternly warn her to be careful. Magdalena sighed. She hated having to spend the majority of her waking hours under Garth's watchful eye. She found the situation incredibly irritating. When it really got to her, she'd pass the hours fantasizing about ripping his thick skull off his scrawny neck. She was skilled enough to do it and seriously considered it, but it wouldn't do to anger the all-too-powerful committee. He was doing their bidding, after all. Focusing her thoughts on the committee always helped her suppress the urge to return to her addiction. The committee was a core group of vampires much older than she. Some dated back to the originals that came from the planet Vampyrus not long after the first humans came to inhabit the Earth. In fact, the humans beat them for habitat dominance by mere centuries. The committee superseded all other vampire rule both on Earth and on the various other planets they'd migrated to when Vampyrus grew so overcrowded that it could no longer support its abundant population. Adventurous pioneers set out to migrate to select planets and set up colonies that would welcome the excess vampires. Earth was one of these planets. It was a small group of vampires that made up the committee. There were no more than 24, and the majority of them were the original brave pioneers that left Vampyrus voluntarily. Others were descendants of vampires that migrated to Earth after the planetary colonization proved successful. Magdalena was a descendant of an original, which put her in line for a seat on the committee, providing she kept her addiction under control. Vampires had always dined on the blood of animal and fowl. When they arrived on Earth, they did their best to coexist peacefully with man. Sadly, man wanted no part of the peace they offered. They began hunting the vampires for food. They were such a barbaric breed, they actually started to doing the same with their own kind. The humans' abhorrent act of cannibalism caused many of the vampires to rise up and retaliate. This resulted in the discovery of just how addictive the blood of a human was. Although the rumors circulated by committee claiming that human blood was poisonous and would kill a vampire eventually proved untrue, the blood did shift the vampire's composition in various ways. The primary shift being the fact that their vampire abilities were rendered useless in the light of day. This left them vulnerable to their human enemies. The blood also shortened their lifespan by a few centuries. So, even though the highly addictive blood of a human wasn't poisonous, in its own roundabout way it did indeed kill. Once addicted to human blood, it was rare a vampire returned to a diet of animal or fowl, no matter what the consequences. That didn't stop many a curious young vampire from trying it out. Magdalena recalled her early education about the turmoil that occurred during the vampires' struggle to settle in on Earth. One of the originals, Dracula, had a very different idea of how they should be living. When the committee issued the edict that vampires must live hidden from man, he and a few followers rebelled. In order to protect themselves from the long arm of the committee, they shimmered into a dark dimension that was ruled by a fallen angel. This angel offered them the protection they sought in exchange for their loyalty. Dracula readily agreed and a new strain of vampire emerged. To differentiate this new strain of vampires from the original vampires, they called themselves vampires. It was these vampires who gained the fame that caught the attention of storytellers who instilled the fear in children and adults. This fear turned the tables and gave vampires the upper hand in many ways. Even so, for some odd reason that neither the members of the committee or the leaders of Vampirus could neither discover nor explain, even though the humans stopped hunting them for food and truly feared the vampire, they maintained their stronghold on Earth. This made it necessary for vampires to adjust accordingly if they were to avoid war, a possible necessary exodus, or even extinction. Not only had vampires been successful in avoiding these things, their numbers had never been stronger. Many, like Magdalena, lived and commingled with the humans quite amiably while keeping their true identity a secret. There were others who hadn't mastered this feat or preferred to separate their worlds as best they could. It was these who chose to join Dracula's army and hunt and feed on human blood. Magdalena mused about the eventuality of her taking her seat on the committee. It would be centuries before a seat became empty after its owner expired. A vampire lived for approximately 10,000 Earth years, give or take. This seemed like an eternity to the inferior humans who were hardly capable of staying alive for a mere century. She spent her days living and commingling with humans and she enjoyed it fully. Would that end? She was living as a human and working in a diner as a hostess because it was one of the requirements set forth by the committee in order to provide her with a greater understanding of the human species in preparation for when she took her place on the committee. Would they allow her to continue this lifestyle once she was seated? An original who could live amongst the humans, undetected, was a valuable asset to the vampire community. There weren't many who'd accomplished it to the degree that Magdalena had. It was something she enjoyed doing. Surely the committee would recognize this and not ask her to stop. She knew that her ability to commingle with humans so well is what led to her latest assignment. She was to observe and report back to the committee on the dealings of a certain diner owner who the committee believed was working for Dracula, but had yet to be able to prove it. This, of course, required that she convince the owner to hire her and she play the part of a human while working there. The committee had no doubt that she could handle whatever may come her way from Dracula's servant if that was what the restaurant owner truly was, but, knowing her weakness and compassion for the human race, Garth was assigned to make certain Magdalena didn't get wrapped up in any of the human drama that plagued our kind. She was reputed to have a penchant for getting mixed up in situations that didn't concern her. Magdalena was expected to observe only while she mingled amongst us. Relationships that resembled friendship or more with the humans were strictly prohibited. Garth, she shuddered at the thought of him. A disgusting, arrogant lycanthrope, yet another creature that humans managed to create misdirecting folklore about. At one time, the lycanthrope was to the vampire, like a dog was to a human. They were brought to Earth by the originals to be their ever-faithful servant and companion. Unfortunately, as time progressed and the lycanthropes lived and mingled with other species on the planet, some of them went rogue. These rogues refused to remain under the rule of the vampire. Through the cohabiting with the powerful wolves of the wild, they'd managed to become far different than the original lycanthropes brought to Earth by the vampire. Unlike the vampire, the lycanthrope didn't split and alienate from their originals. Instead, the entire mass followed the same path. Because of this, the majority of the lycanthrope kingdom considered themselves superior to the vampire, as well as their enemy. There were very few lycanthropes left who were willing to befriend and attest loyalty to a vampire without being forced into submission by captivity or ensorcelling. Garth was one of these few. This was mainly because his great-great-great-great-great-grandmother was a vampire who commingled with a lycanthrope. Although it was possible, it was something that was strictly forbidden amongst both races. Most of her vampire traits were eventually bred out of Garth's bloodline. He was left only with the vampire's ability to shimmer and ensorcelle. Magdalena found it hard to believe Garth possessed 1 ounce of her precious vampire gene in his ugly body. Yet, she was assured that his loyalty was due to the fact that he still had vampire relatives seated on the committee and in government back on Vampyrus, distant though we may be, which made him feel connected to them. Although this connection was known to cause him grief and discomfort when the dominant lycanthrope side brought forth the memories of vampire hatred, Magdalena couldn't deny his loyalty to her kind. His life must be a torture of the oddest sort, she thought with a sigh. So many changes. So much corruption and deterioration. Why? She just didn't understand. Her father did his best to keep her sheltered from the evils that lurked amongst her own people. Even so, she'd managed to discover a great deal of it either first-hand, or by word of mouth. Now that she'd reached the age that required she begin her education and preparation for her place next to the others of the committee, she was rapidly being exposed to more and more shocking and unbelievable corruption. In earlier years, it was only Dracula who occupied the stories told her by the elders. She'd found the stories quite fascinating. The humans had managed to distort the story to the point that the truth of it had been buried deep within the myth. Dracula was the leader of the vampire lineage that was created by the rogue vampire leader, Dracula. He started out as a kind of fair count amongst his people who was made vampire as a result of trying to protect his good friend Vlad the Impaler. Vlad was a man who possessed a deep, dark side which he expressed by imposing incredible cruelty upon his enemy with little, if any, remorse. He'd sometimes performed acts of cruelty that caused even Dracula to raise an eyebrow or two. When Vlad was young, he made a deal with Dracula. If Dracula would assist Vlad in saving his land, he'd swear possession of his much-coveted human soul to Dracula upon his death. As the years progressed, Dracula quietly observed Vlad's ever-increasing evil ways of dealing with his enemies with great interest. It seemed trading his soul to a vampire who'd morphed into a being of darkness somehow connected Vlad to that darkness. When Vlad was thrown into prison after being severely wounded and captured by his enemies, his good friend the Count, who was a general in Vlad's army, traded places with him in hopes of saving Vlad's life and eventually being rescued by Vlad once Vlad recovered. When Dracula arrived at the dungeon to claim Vlad's soul and found the general there in his stead, he was furious. He accused the Count of conspiring with Vlad to cheat him out of claiming his soul. No matter what the Count said, his pleas landed on deaf ears. Dracula punished the Count by turning him into a vampire. To appease his vanity and twisted sense of humor, and because the general was a count already, he named him Count Dracula. With the aid of a sorcerer, he made sure his vampire creation couldn't be destroyed by humans. This added an extra measure of torture to the Count, who was now doomed to an eternity of living in darkness off the blood of his fellow man. Dracula can still be killed by a vampire if they removed his head, or by a lycanthrope if torn to pieces and the heart eaten, or by my bloodline if shot in the heart by a wooden stake, but he can never die a natural death such as that of a human or such as a vampire from Vampyrus would one day experience. He'd never progress forward on the path of evolution like a human or a vampire from Vampyrus. Dracula was stuck as he was for eternity. Although Garth was certainly capable of taking care of himself, until she knew exactly what kind of creatures they were up against, she didn't want an altercation. A blood-curdling scream permeated the air as the woman was lifted off the ground with supernatural ease. Magdalena noticed that the mutant vampire holding her was levitating about a foot from the concrete sidewalk. She would have thought that the ingestion of human flesh and blood would have stripped them of such traits and wondered what other vampire skills the mutants possessed. As if in response to her musing, the other mutant spun into the air with such speed that he disappeared before he stopped in mid-air and slowly lowered himself to the sidewalk. "They're playing with their food," she mused, "how disgusting." Her reaction to the mutant behavior was more powerful than she'd intended. She quickly discovered that one of them also had the gift of telepathy when he released his captive unceremoniously and cocked his head, while sniffing the air. She perked her ears to hear their exchange of words and discovered that they were aware of another underworld being in their midst and this other being considered them disgusting. She cursed herself for being so careless while she watched the mutant vampires push the humans aside and start in her direction. Heaving a sigh of regret, Magdalena braced herself for what was to come. She was grateful for her age and strength. One of the few core traits that all vampires maintained was the strength that came with age. These mutant vampires were babies in comparison. Her age gave her a definite advantage, even if it was 2 against 1. She also had training and natural cunning on her side. As they drew near, Magdalena stepped out of the shadows and stood boldly beneath the street lamp. "What have we here?" the taller mutant growled. The fact that Magdalena stepped back to avoid spittle flying from his mouth as he spoke didn't go unnoticed, nor was it taken well. He growled and moved toward her threateningly. "What is she?" the other asked with a genuine curiosity that caused his companion to stop and think. "A cousin perhaps," the tall one replied in a manner that didn't disguise his mood. After looking at her intently, the shorter one said, "I think not. She looks too human." The tall one sniffed the air. "She don't smell human," he said. "No, she certainly does not," the other replied. There was an odd tone in his voice. Magdalena couldn't decide if it was sarcasm or amusement. "Is she edible?" the tall one asked, in a tone that was almost teasing. "All creatures are edible," the shorter one replied with a drawl that Magdalena recognized as Deep South. "True," his companion said. "Very true." The shorter vampire looked back at the humans who stood huddled together as if to protect each other. "So, now we decide," he said with a voice that reeked of excitement. "Do we eat the humans, who we know are delectable, or this unknown creature that tastes like Dracula knows what? Blood is blood, and flesh is flesh, is it not, my vampire friends?" Magdalena cooed as she inched herself into a location that would provide her with the greatest advantage when it came time to fight. "Ha! Ha!" roared the taller one. "She can't be a vampire to say such a ridiculous thing." The shorter vampire cocked his head and tapped his chin. "I agree," he said as he lowered his hand and heaved a sigh. "You aren't a werewolf, are you?" He sniffed the air. "No, you aren't smelly enough. In fact, you smell quite nice." Before she could respond he sniffed the air again and added, "Dear me, whatever could you be?" "A fairy, or maybe a ghost?" the taller one volunteered. Magdalena watched the couple run off. She looked up and down the street for signs of life, but saw nothing. They were alone. "Now, will you look at that?" the taller one said with mock dismay. "Our meal has run away. It seems we have no choice but to eat you now." With lightning speed, Magdalena twirled her body until she could no longer be seen. Unlike the display the mutant vampire made, she became completely invisible. It was as if she'd never been there. By the look on their bewildered faces, she could have probably left without them being able to track her, but that would have left these creeps free to roam the streets and terrorize, if not kill, more humans, not to mention multiply. She just couldn't abide the thought. Still invisible, she reached for the tall vampire's head and snapped his neck. She pulled on his head until it popped away from his body. Taken aback by the ease in which it occurred, she stumbled to the ground, thus becoming visible once more. The smaller vampire stared in horror at his companion's head that was still in her grasp. He hoped to figure out a way to rejoin his buddy's head to his body before she figured out that a stake was needed to be driven through his heart before he'd be completely lost to life, and then only if it was driven by a slayer of the Tugurlan lineage. He couldn't imagine the mess they'd have on their hands if he tried to rejuvenate while she still had his head by his locks. "You won't get it back," she said flatly. She held the vampire's severed head up in the air as she searched her pockets for a lighter. "Don't try." "What are you?" the vampire roared with anguished disbelief. "I'm your worst nightmare," she replied. Disgusted that she hadn't a lighter at her immediate disposal, she tossed the vampire's head away and kicked the shorter vampire square in the jaw with such speed he wasn't able to see it coming. He stumbled back, completely stunned. Shaking his head only briefly, he regained his composure with such surprising ease that, for a brief moment, Magdalena was taken aback. She quickly regained her stance and braced herself for his attack. The battle between mutant vampire and vampire echoed through the street. Magdalena was amazed at the amount of strength her opponent possessed. It was far greater than she'd expected, or than what should be for a creature so young. Even so, she held her own. She was grateful for her early education in the art of battle, which included jousting, fencing, and martial arts. It was her martial arts skills that she pulled upon to best him. She reached deep into her memory bank and pulled upon every martial art trick she could recall. It was working, but not without excessive effort on her part. Since Magdalena hadn't displayed her fangs during the battle, the mutant was still uncertain about her identity. "What are you?" he asked with winded frustration just before he got lucky enough to get a good hold on her torso. As he slammed her against a century-old brick building, she felt a rib crack. The sound rang out into the night, encouraging him to summon a renewed strength as he wrapped his hands around the base of her head. Her senses reeled. If she wasn't careful she wouldn't have to worry about him pulling her head off, one slip of her rib into her heart and she'd disappear into oblivion. She slammed her forearms into his chest and knocked the wind from his lungs just before spreading her arms wide and forcing his grip to release. He was still struggling to regain his breath when she spun a kick into his stomach. He doubled over in anguished surprise. Without a moment's hesitation, Magdalena gripped his head with both hands and twisted it away from his body. This time she was ready for the ease in which it popped off and maintained her stance. She stood in silence with the mutant head still in her hands and covered in blood as she focused on regaining a steady breath. The exertion of the fight had been far greater than she'd ever experienced in the past, plus her ribs hurt. She'd heal soon enough, but, until then, the pain was great. I watched Magdalena don her coat and hat and smiled. She looked like she'd stepped out of a 1950s magazine. She's a woman who's secure in herself. I like that, I mused. What are you smiling at? Shen asked as he craned his head to look in the same direction as I was looking. Oh, our hostess. Why did I even ask? It looks like her shift is over, he proclaimed as he finished the last of his tea. I suppose we will follow her. I chuckled as I stood up and tossed enough money on the table to cover the bill as well as a tip for our very strange server. You guessed right, I chuckled. We better hurry, Shen said as he watched Magdalena make her way down the diner entry steps and onto the street. The lady has quite a gait on her. Let's go, I said in an urgent tone. As we started to exit the diner, we were waylaid by the ever-insistent Garth, who was determined that we present our bill to the cashier instead of leaving the money on the table. Realizing we were fighting a losing battle, Shen quickly returned to the table to grab the money and the bill and do as Garth bid us to do. By the time we'd appeased Garth, who suddenly lost the speed he'd so readily displayed moments earlier, and made our way to the street, there was no sign of Magdalena. I stomped my foot with disgust. Sensing that there was more to my desire to follow the hostess than the fact that she was a beautiful woman, Shen closed his eyes and concentrated. Allowing his body to relax, he pictured Magdalena walking out of the diner as he'd only recently witnessed and make her way down the street. Opening his eyes with satisfaction, he started in the same direction he'd seen her go in his vision. "So, now you're a tracker?" I said incredulously. "You do not have to follow," he replied as he shoved his hands in his pockets, lowered his head as if looking for tracks, and continued on. I scooted up next to him and matched his pace. No. I'm with you, buddy," I chuckled, "you're just full of surprises. That's all." He looked up at me and smiled. "I guess I am," he chuckled. "Seriously," I asked, "where'd you learn that?" "Dao Ming and I spent time with the old man in China. I thought it might prove helpful," he replied. "Hell, yes," I said as I gave him a friendly slap on the back. We caught up with Magdalena just in time to witness her beating the tar out of a mutant vampire while a headless body lay at her feet. As we started forward to assist, we stopped short when she ripped her opponent's head from his body. "Whoa!" I whispered. "She's some dame." "She is a vampire slayer?" Shen asked with surprised confusion. "It looks that way," I replied, "but if she's a Tugurlan I'll eat my hat." My eyes never left Magdalena. "We'd better warn her that pulling off the head isn't a permanent death. Do we have something to use as a stake?" Shen stretched up and pulled a slender branch down far enough to allow him to break a thin extension off. He quickly stripped the tiny shoots of foliage from the narrow but sturdy shoot, snapped it in half, squared his shoulders and nodded in the direction of Magdalena. Satisfied, I nodded my approval and followed suit. Magdalena was so engrossed in the matter at hand that our approach went unnoticed. It wasn't until she heard the steady rhythm of my clapping as I walked up next to her that she realized she wasn't alone. Very good," I bellowed as I moved swiftly up to the headless torsos and quickly drove our makeshift stakes first into one heart and then into the other. Magdalena watched in sickened horror as the mutants dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind rumpled clothing and an extremely foul stench. She rubbed her nose absent-mindedly. "It is because they are cannibals," Shen offered. "These weren't normal vampires," I explained when Magdalena looked at us questioningly. "We've seen and killed both. The normal ones don't stink. These vampires eat human flesh. That's what you smell. It's the rot of undigested human flesh. That is completely intolerable." Magdalena screeched. She was unable to listen to any more. She was doing her best to move past the fact that these men admitted to being slayers, but couldn't deal with the concept of rotten flesh remaining inside the bodies of a vampire, mutant or otherwise. I know, I added as I moved forward to offer my support by putting my arm around her. She jumped back and did her best to compose herself from the immediate urge to hunt that purged from deep within her. The sudden movement caused her damaged rib to undo the little healing that began. She groaned her agony. The pain in her chest was intense. "Oh, please don't puncture my heart," she thought frantically. "Don't touch me," she groaned. "Are you okay?" Shen asked as he moved closer while keeping his hands in the air to show he wasn't going to touch her. "My rib, it's bruised, I think," she replied. "You shouldn't be moving around. That was a pretty intense fight." "You might have a broken rib," I said with concern. "We need to take you to the hospital." "I just need to get home," she assured us. "I'll be fine in a bit. I just need to get home." Shen and I locked eyes. There was something not right about the scene before us, but neither of us could put our finger on it. "Where do you live?" Shen asked. "We will help you get home." "I can make it alone," she said. "No, you can't," I said with authority. Magdalena looked from me to Shen and then back to me, as if she was trying to make a decision. She finally nodded her head. I live a few blocks away, she said softly. I think I'll need your help to walk. I was so focused on my rib that I didn't notice my foot. It feels like it's broken,